Phil, would you like me to spin the camera around so you can see some of the room?
Yeah, that would also be great. Yeah.
Because otherwise,
yeah, because it's so it feels a bit disembodied. Yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
It's not. It's going to be a bit of a side view because the camera's in a bit of an awkward position, but it'd be better than what you're seeing now.
Yeah, just to get a sense to the space. Thanks.
Okie doke.
Hi. Cool. Yeah, that's good. I have been in that space, but I think it's been refurbished. It didn't look like that when I was last there.
Yeah, it definitely has, because the last time I was here, it was pretty different. They've got a lot of new audiovisual kit in it. It's not a bad setup, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. No, it looks nice and compact. Yeah, the technology, touch wood, has held up very well today.
Yeah, it's a nice little theatre.
Yeah, it's what you want. It's perfect for an event like this. Not too big, not too small.
True.
Thanks, Hi, Phil. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can. Hey, Andre, how's it going?
Oh, great.
Good, man.
Here next to me, let me try to show you.
Oh, look, darling, if we go down there, then
you can see us now, probably.
Hello.
Okay, we're gonna go down. I'm with Gwen here.
Oh yeah, I can see you walking down. It's like the Oscars.
Hi everyone in the Zoom chat.
It's like the procession.
Here we are. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can. Hi.
Perfect. Great, and we can hear you perfectly.
Right.
And the chair is coming to say hi, and we are waiting for people to start coming into the room.
Hi Gwen, how's it going?
you. I'm so sorry that you're not here with us.
Yeah, I'm sorry too. Very disappointing. Of all the weeks in the last 2 years to get COVID, and this was the one. It's very, very disappointing. So I'm sorry.
It's bad luck, but how are you feeling? You're okay to
I'm not.
present?
Yeah, I'm all right. I've felt better, but you know, I'm still standing. Just sorry. That's all.
Well, we really appreciate you coming in and talking to us, even though you're not feeling your normal self.
No, absolutely fine. My pleasure. Yeah, it's been a great day so far. Taking lots of notes.
You've been listening. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I've been on since the start. So yeah, it's been great.
So just have you got a time in mind for your presentation? Have you been asked to take a specific time?
Yeah,
Or?
I was told 20 to 25 minutes. So I'll try to keep it at the 20 end of that spectrum.
I think 20 is what, because we're obviously running.
We're running over time. Yeah, exactly.
I
Yeah,
think
I've cut it.
if we
Even in
try
the
and keep
break.
it to 20, that would be great. Yeah.
Even in the break, I've cut a few things. So
you can always shoehorn them back in the Q&A.
totally. Yeah, absolutely. It's,
Do you have a PowerPoint, Phil? Or
I don't know. It's just going to be me up here in this bunker. So.
All right. Well, I will leave you there waiting peacefully while people filter in.
No worries.
I will go and see what the score is with. Do I need to mute myself or anything, or I don't need to mute anything when he's not speaking, or he. Right. Okay. Great. Excellent. I'll see you shortly, Phil.
Okay. Thanks, Gwen.
Because I don't think what I'm saying is so new, but it's maybe an attempt to give a theoretical understanding to what we are doing, and from maybe a fresh angle, from a complexity theory angle. That's maybe what's new. And then it's looking at the same thing, but from maybe a fresh perspective, which then always opens up some understandings or dimensions, but it doesn't, because I don't think it necessarily is so different from what we're doing.
Yeah.
But maybe this is a more conscious
to theorize.
To theorize or to explain why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess I was going to also ask you, when you sit down, please try to sit on the last 3 chairs coming towards here, because in the corner, the far corner, we cannot capture with the camera.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
But now it's only me,
it's
and
only
me and the moderator.
And Phil Clark,
and Phil's going to be on the
probably
screen.
seeing you through the screen, and we are seeing him here.
Yeah.
And Gwen is going to be the chair. So Gwen is going to be with you sitting there.
Yeah.
Fortunately. When are you going back to Norway? Tomorrow?
Tomorrow morning early. Actually, I'm going to New York for a week, but I'm leaving here tomorrow morning early, and then go to fly via Copenhagen and then to New York.
So I guess we will have the chance to, after the conference, go for a drink,
Yes,
a pint. Or
yes. I
something
think
like
Liz
that,
was
or-
speaking
Yeah.
about us maybe going together for
Yeah.
something, so that
Yeah,
would be
yeah.
very nice.
That I think is,
Yeah.
is a nice
Yeah.
idea with,
Yeah.
with some of the speakers who are
Yeah.
staying for
Yeah.
another night.
That would be great.
Fantastic, great. So
Maybe we
I
need
think-
to make an effort to get people. Okay, thanks. The water's gone.
Oh. Okay, everyone, if we could finish filtering in, finish up our coffees. I think we need to get started on the last plenary of the day, please. Thank you. Just give everyone a minute to take their seats. Welcome back. My name is Gwen Bernier. I'm an anthropologist here at Oxford, and I'm a member of Dialogo, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing the final panel of the day, which is on the topic of learning from the unexpected in peacebuilding. And we have two speakers here with us today. The first speaker is Phil Clark from SOAS, who is joining us on Zoom. And we're very grateful to you, Phil, for being here and taking the time and making the effort to share your thoughts and knowledge with us, despite having COVID today. So thank you for being strong enough to do that. not always easy working and presenting when one's not feeling one's best. So we really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. And then we'll have Phil will be followed by Cedric de Koning from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, who's here with us in person. And each of them have about 20 minutes to speak, and we're running slightly short, so I will be asking them both to keep it to 20 minutes. And I'm not going to present any more about them because you've got all of their details of their bios in your handbooks. So without further ado, I will hand over to Phil. The floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gwen, and to Liz and Andre, to Oxpeace and Rodimos e Dialogo for this very kind invitation to present. And again, I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. It's ironic that presenting today on multi-level peace building in the COVID-19 era, I've gone and gotten COVID this week, having avoided it for 2 years. I want to focus on the relevance of COVID-19 for our thinking about multi-level peace building and reconciliation, because COVID really has challenged peace building efforts across the globe. It's exacerbated the drivers of conflict in many places. It's disrupted peace endeavors in many locations. And so I think we need to think through the implications of COVID specifically, but also the implications of all-encompassing shocks, society-wide shocks for our understanding of peace building. And shocks, of course, can come in many forms, and some shocks are more shocking than others. I'm going to talk today particularly about pandemics, but this is hopefully an entry point into discussions about the relevance of environmental crisis, economic collapse, political upheaval, such as we've seen around Brexit in Northern Ireland, as Brandon talked about today, or the peace referendum in Colombia, as Andre talked about. These shocks come in lots and lots of different forms, and I think we need to think through the implications of these for peace building efforts. Now, I'm going to focus particularly on Rwanda today, but I'm hoping that some key features of the Rwandan case illuminate much bigger issues that I hope have some relevance for other contexts. I've been researching in Rwanda nearly every year for the last 20 years. I've been conducting longitudinal research in the same 12 communities since 2003. And this includes doing fieldwork in Rwanda during COVID last year as part of a book that I'm working on at the moment. So I'm going to draw very heavily on that recent period of fieldwork. And I think that the Rwandan government is right when it says that COVID is Rwanda's biggest challenge since the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. This is a country that, as many will know, has gone through, I think, a pretty remarkable transformation in that period. And yet COVID, I think, really has rocked the society to its foundations in ways that I'll talk about in just a moment. I'm going to very briefly focus on 4 issues in this presentation. And Gwen, I know, is a justifiably very strict chair, so she's going to keep me to 20 minutes on this. I firstly want to say something about how I think, based on my research, everyday Rwandans interpret the concept of reconciliation. Secondly, I want to look at how Rwanda has pursued reconciliation with, I would argue, considerable success. Thirdly, I'll look at how COVID has challenged this. And then fourthly, I want to point to some broader lessons from this experience for context around the world. So 4 parts to this presentation. Let me begin by just briefly discussing how I think my respondents in Rwanda since 2003 have talked about reconciliation. I think one of the things we have to recognize right at the outset is that Rwanda is quite remarkable in the sense that, unlike all of its neighbors, it has not experienced mass violence on its territory since the genocide in 1994. That might seem like a very simple thing to point out, but it's remarkable how often that's overlooked in the story of Rwanda's trajectory since the genocide. And I think it's particularly remarkable when you put it in the context of hundreds of thousands of convicted genocide perpetrators now living side by side with genocide survivors on densely crowded hills, because that's the socioeconomic, that's the demographic reality of Rwanda today. Now, of course, Rwanda has been embroiled in conflict elsewhere in the region, and it's undoubtedly been a generator of conflict outside of its borders. But I think it's important to begin with the reality of what has happened inside the country since '94. One of the very strong refrains coming through my research since 2003, across the ethnic divide with actors at all levels of Rwandan society and follow-up interviews in the same communities over many years, is a very strong desire for something much more than peaceful coexistence. I was particularly struck by Brandon's comments about some skepticism about peaceful coexistence as the ultimate endpoint in a place like Northern Ireland. The concept of peaceful existence is treated with enormous suspicion in Rwanda, mainly because between 1973 and 1994, many people would characterize that period as one of peaceful coexistence. But of course, it was a period in which serious divisions and tensions in Rwandan society were left addressed and laid the seeds for the genocide in 1994. So there's a real suspicion about peaceful coexistence. Now, this I think is important. We see that reconciliation has real purchase in the Rwandan terrain. In a second, I'll talk about the specific components of that, but I want to situate this debate about peaceful coexistence and reconciliation in the literature at the moment, because many of you will be familiar, and Andre and I have been talking about this for a very long time. There's a very strong literature on what is now known as agonistic peacebuilding or agonistic reconciliation, which basically says that the best that post-conflict societies can hope for is to create spaces for non-violent dialogue, and that most calls for reconciliation involve overly romantic, overly optimistic attempts to fundamentally resolve past conflicts and past identities. And so for that reason, there's this emphasis on basically people continuing the conflicts of the past, but in a non-violent fashion, and a very heavy emphasis on dialogue. Now, to simplify things, in the Rwandan context, most of my respondents would dismiss that argument out of hand and would say, that's not enough for us. We need to aim for something more than that. We do need to rebuild and reconceive relationships at all levels of society in completely different ways. And also, talk is not enough. The agonistic emphasis on dialogue alone is insufficient. One of the things that runs all through my research in Rwanda is a very strong emphasis that reconciliation involves action. It involves cooperation. It involves engagement. So we've got the agonistic literature, which I would argue we should be skeptical of. I think it's insufficiently robust. I think it's insufficiently optimistic. It narrows the parameters of what certain societies may be able to achieve or believe is important. More broadly, I would say in the literature, or much of the literature, reconciliation is becoming a bit of a dirty word. Some of you may have even seen recently a special issue in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute with a piece by Richard Wilson on the theme of irreconciliation, the idea that that conflicts are often so intractable that reconciliation is simply fanciful. And so I think the Rwandan experience, at least my respondents, I think would challenge that kind of view as well. To summarize, the view of reconciliation that I think comes out of at least my Rwandan research is that this is not a romantic concept at all. It's incredibly practical. And I often ask my respondents, what would reconciliation look like? What are we looking for at different levels of society? And they emphasize very practical things. We eat and drink together. We work together on each other's farms, very heavy emphasis on cooperative agricultural activities. We attend each other's weddings and funerals. We help each other during illness. Now, I'll come back to that because that's particularly salient in the COVID context. And we help each other during other crises that befall members of our community. So these are not romantic, these are not abstract things. These are very concrete day-to-day activities that many of my respondents believe signifies that reconciliation is starting to take place, and it's something practically that should be aimed for. And in much of my work, I've argued that I think actually Rwanda has made substantial strides in achieving this kind of reconciliation. So then secondly, how has Rwanda gone about this? In a multi-level sense, because that's the emphasis of our conference today, what are the mutually reinforcing processes at different levels of Rwandan society that have been important in pursuing reconciliation? And I, in a very schematic way, want to suggest that there are three crucial processes that do different things at different levels. One has been the Gacaca community courts, 12,000 village trials between 2002 and 2012 that prosecuted 400,000 genocide cases. I think what's particularly important about this enormous, imperfect, unruly, unpredictable process of village justice, which I followed for all of those 10 years, is that they firstly created a really important space for open contestation and confrontation between community members about the past and about the future. And also that it delivered punitive justice. Now, this is something we haven't talked about too much today, the importance of punishment. That in the Rwandan case, not just in the genocide survivor community, but even in some segments of the perpetrator community, there is a sense that for perpetrators to go back and live peacefully on the hills with their neighbors, that there needs to have been some sense of direct reckoning with the past and some kind of punishment. And Rwanda used a very creative form of punishment, particularly community service through Gacaca to do so. And I think that Gacaca process, getting these crimes out in the open, generating a public debate, and delivering a very tangible form of justice to genocide perpetrators was incredibly important for the overall pursuit of reconciliation. The second crucial process towards reconciliation that Rwanda has embarked on is a really systematic welfare system. Now, this is something that we often don't hear in debates about Rwanda. What is remarkable, I think, about the Rwandan story over the last 28 years, with all of its problems, with all of its political conflicts, its increasing, I would say, authoritarianism, is that this very illiberal state has in fact delivered the most systematic welfare program in the region. Just one indicator of that is that in the space of 15 years, Rwanda halved its child mortality rate because of massive investment in healthcare and health services. So that, of course, reduces the fear of death in the context of childbirth, a really important issue for well-being and people's ability to think about the future. But crucially, and this is one of the things that I've been mapping in my research since 2003, is a very sustained sense at the local level, especially in rural areas, that state welfare in healthcare, education, and other areas has drastically decreased socioeconomic inequality across the ethnic divide. And I can't overstate the importance of this, that when Kagame stands up and says, we are all Rwandans now, and we need to overcome ethnic identity and embrace a sense of the Rwandan identity, many of my Hutu respondents are very suspicious of that kind of dialogue or that kind of discourse, except when they see that there is some tangible reality in their day-to-day life. Their own socioeconomic uplift matches this rhetoric of a greater sense of Rwandanness. And it has numerous other problems, but at least in socioeconomic terms, this, I think, has been absolutely essential to dealing with some of the key drivers of the genocide in 1994. What's crucial here too is that in discussions about socioeconomic inequality after 1994, people often point to Rwanda's very drastic Gini coefficient, but that, I think, shrouds a much more important reality. That is often a Gini coefficient generated by the disjunct between the socioeconomic reality in Kigali and the socioeconomic reality out in the rural areas. And undoubtedly there is a massive gulf there. But that's not how the vast majority of rural respondents understand inequality. They don't compare themselves with people living in Kigali because it may as well be another planet. They compare themselves with their neighbors. And there we are seeing a high degree of equality manifesting, especially in the last 20 years. And many of my Hutu respondents tell me very openly, they never expected Kagame and the RPF to do this. They expected that a minority Tutsi government would do what every previous Rwandan regime had done, which was to favor their own ethnic group. And they're pleasantly surprised by what they've experienced under the RPF. Now, they're fearful of the RPF in many other respects, government surveillance, repression, the rest of it. But on these really important socioeconomic terms, there has been, I think, some really important improvements there. And I was going to give examples of and share a couple of anecdotes, but I'm aware of the time. The third, I think, important process contributing to reconciliation in Rwanda is at the community level. So we've got Gacaca, which was a state-orchestrated, community-based approach. We've got the welfare system, which is delivered by the state. But below the purview of the state, after Gacaca, we've seen a range of really important informal, locally driven processes with a key emphasis on dialogue. There's this huge national patchwork of associations, student clubs, economic cooperatives, church groups, you name it. You go to any community in Rwanda and there'll be 20 of these groups who meet every week, sometimes multiple times a week, to talk about current and historical problems. And I've sat in on hundreds of these meetings. And in many respects, they replicate much of the discourse of Gacaca. We're going to meet in open spaces and talk about the underlying problems in our community, and we're going to seek some kind of collective solution to that. These are quieter, less visible forms of reconciliation between individuals and groups, and I think they crucially complement what we've seen at the national level. So there are multiple processes at different levels performing complementary peace and reconciliation related dimensions. And I think it's when you put these things together with it, we start to get a sense of why Rwanda is where it is today. The third big theme of this lecture then is, what has COVID done to all of this? And I think the crux here is that COVID has really challenged the basis of reconciliation that was laid by those three really important processes. The reasons for this are probably pretty self-evident in many respects. One crucial impact of COVID in Rwanda, and it should be said that Rwanda dealt with COVID pretty well. Its numbers were very, very low, but it came at an enormous cost, particularly in terms of the collapse of the formal and the informal economies, leading to massive food insecurity. Now, I was locked down with my wife and 3 children. I have to say, having COVID this week is not a patch on being locked down with my wife and 3 children aged under 6. And we were locked down in Kigali at 2 different junctures over 5 months. I was in the countryside most of the time, but in the lockdowns, I was obviously in Kigali, and also doing much more research in Kigali than I've done in a long time because of lockdown. I've never seen so much begging in Rwanda in my 20 years of going there. There is a real cultural opposition in Rwanda to begging, especially from foreigners. There is a deep cultural discourse around self-reliance. Now, COVID pushed people to the edge because many people really were on the brink of starvation, especially in Kigali. Now, this, I think, is important for understanding the impact of COVID and our thinking about shocks, is that there wasn't uniform impact of COVID across the country. Particularly, there was a big rural and urban divide. One of the things that was really striking during my fieldwork in the countryside last year was the substantial resilience of rural communities, both in a socioeconomic but in a relational sense during COVID, in contrast to what was going on in Kigali. And I think that this wasn't only about COVID. I think it points to the fact that those 3 reconciliation contributing processes I meant before perhaps had taken greater root in rural areas. There had been much higher Gacaca turnouts in the countryside. There tends to be less government surveillance of people's everyday interactions in the countryside. Maybe that's helped rural communities get further along the pathway towards reconciliation. But crucially, during COVID, one of the things that became so important was that rural communities could continue to grow food and they could continue to eat, in contrast to urbanites, particularly in Kigali, who could do no such thing. And one of the ways that this manifest was suddenly there were rural to urban remittances. So many of my rural respondents were sending mobile money, and sometimes even, despite the lockdown restrictions, smuggling food to their relatives in Kigali. One of my long-term respondents is a convicted genocide perpetrator. In my research, I call him Cypriet. He laughed when he told me the lengths that he'd gone to get tomatoes, maize, and bananas to his relatives in Kigali and Nyagatare, which is one of the other big towns. This guy is seriously clever, and he has all sorts of connections and networks, and he made them work to his advantage. The UN Food Programme should sign Cypriet up immediately, but that was the kind of thing that was happening in many, many rural communities, completely reversing the trend of remittances from rural to urban areas. And this is where I think Graham Simpson's presentation on the previous panel really struck a chord with me when he talked about urban youth, not just youth, but specifically urban youth, because I think there's a big problem that COVID has created in the Rwandan context amongst youth living in Kigali. These were an urban poor that was already poor before COVID. In the midst of COVID, there was massive land expropriation and housing destruction that was happening right across Kigali. This is part of the rejuvenation of Kigali for Kagami's Vision 2050. And so this was producing huge anger, particularly amongst those living in Kigali and particularly amongst young people who had been promised that the economic growth and the opportunities that many people had experienced since 1994 would continue ad infinitum, and COVID absolutely put the brakes on that. And it certainly put the brakes on the Rwandan welfare system, which many people had relied on very heavily up until then. To summarize, I think the major impact of COVID in terms of peace building and reconciliation in Rwanda was that it created a huge amount of psychosocial trauma for people. It put a huge stress on community relations. A mantra in so many of my interviews, especially in Kigali, was that people had become selfish. They had stopped caring about others. There was a huge amount of anger directed towards the government because of the breakdown in the welfare system. Just this week, last week, I was talking to some colleagues of mine who work on sociotherapy in Rwanda, and they're saying that this has been the toughest year that they can remember. Around the commemoration period in April, but because of COVID, they've seen a drastic increase in people's trauma and a real weakening of many community relations. I think the reason for this is that COVID, in many respects, directly undermined the way that Rwanda had specifically gone about reconciliation. So much of Rwanda's recovery has been based on an idea of proximity, of people engaging directly with one another, whether that was through gacaca, whether that was through community dialogues. It wasn't agonistic. It wasn't about sort of expecting that you couldn't get to a more optimistic future. It was much more in your face than that. There was a high degree of engagement, and also a sustained welfare program had been really important in this respect. Well, COVID challenged both of that. Lockdown meant that people couldn't visit one another. People started muttering about each other. And also many people were locked down in their homes. There was drone surveillance in Kigali and in some villages. People would suddenly look up in the sky and there would be a government drone hovering over their house, which was hugely shaming for them in the community because their neighbors started muttering about what that family was doing to contravene the strictures of the lockdown. So I would argue, and I'm being schematic here because of the time, that Rwanda's come a long way in terms of reconciliation, but because of COVID, I would say it's a country currently in flux. There's a serious process of reorientation going on. I would say most acutely in Kigali, but it's there in the countryside as well. And those 28 years of hard work on reconciliation are really being profoundly challenged. In 2 minutes, Gwen, please forgive me. Why is this important beyond Rwanda? I think it's crucial that I talk about Rwanda in detail because I think these things, the impact of COVID is so profoundly important for that society. But I also think that there are things here that we should keep an eye on in other contexts. And let me literally deliver them as bullet points. The first one is we've got to be prepared for shocks when we think about peace building and reconciliation. Expect the unexpected. We have to build shocks more systematically into peace building and reconciliation theory and practice. As Tanya said earlier today, and I think it was such a crucial point, peace building is perpetual. It's never a one side. It's never a set piece process. It's ongoing. And I look forward to Cedric's presentation in a minute on adaptive peace. Peace building has to be multifaceted and dynamic within the same society. There are different actors at different levels who have different needs, and those needs change over time. And peace building and reconciliation have to respond in that sense. One of the things that comes through very strongly, I think, in the Rwandan case is that we've got to focus on Kigali. And I think that there has been a tendency sometimes to think that the great economic boom of the city was going to carry so many people. Well, I think it's leaving people behind. COVID has exacerbated that, and that has huge repercussions for reconciliation. So there's a whole analysis to be done about the links between peace building and urbanization. Peace building also requires care. And I think this is a really important word that comes out of my research, is that, and again, I think this is in contrast to much of what we see in the agonistic literature. We have a huge amount to learn from social work and anthropology about how we conceptualize care and how it connects to reconciliation at all levels of society. And that includes care for individuals. This is why I think Ufra's presentation was also so important, because it got us to think about how much peace and reconciliation is national, community level, group-based, but it's also about individuals and their psychological and their material circumstances. And then finally, looking beyond the Rwandan context, reconciliation, I think, still has purchase in so many settings. This is a term, it's not a dirty term. It shouldn't be automatically dismissed as romantic and impractical. Now, we have to admit, sometimes in the literature, we've talked about reconciliation in romantic ways. So people who have thought that it's an important context have sometimes been their own worst enemy here. But I think the Rwandan case shows that this is not a fanciful, abstract term. It's got real purchase. It's got real solidity to it. And at least amongst my respondents over the last 20 years, reconciliation's absolutely seen, not as a choice, but as an imperative. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Phil. Your presentation made me think of Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, and the idea that in moments of extreme shocks and changes, governments, institutions, people can introduce all kinds of restraining and restricting and undermining measures that we really need to protect against. And I love your idea of care almost as an antidote to shock in the midst of things like COVID and many other shocks. All right, thank you, Phil, and we'll move on to Cedric, please.
I didn't shut Phil down there when I closed the laptop. I was worried about that. Good afternoon, everyone. And also to our listeners online, if there are still any, thank you for your resilience to stay with us up to this late hour. I'm going to talk to you about adaptive mediation, and I'm focusing in on mediation because it's kind of a microcosm of what we're talking about when we talk more broadly about peace processes. And so I think, although I'm going to focus in on mediation, I hope that you can scale it in your minds also when we talk about peace processes more broadly. And of course, I want to link it to our question, which is about who builds peace. And I think when we talk about who builds peace, it's of course, for me, an important, and many people have mentioned it today, that it's really about striking the right balance between those who are affected by conflict and those who are there to help those affected by conflict, to deal with the conflict that they're engaging with. And this is not black and white. This is obviously a spectrum with very many different actors and levels on that spectrum. We spoke today about, I think Jean-Paul Manson used the words entangled, embedded. If we think about these relationships that we are talking about between those who are affected by conflict and those who are helping in one or other way. We can also think in terms of scales or circuits. And this is where I think another issue that came up a couple of times today is important, is the fact that although we may be focusing, for instance, in dealing with a particular conflict with a community affected by that conflict, they are of course not able to, at that level, bring about change at other levels, so maybe at the regional, national, international level, although there are things happening at those levels that have an influence on the local conflict, right? So as peace builders especially, that can move between these different levels, or that are located at different levels. So for instance, someone like Jonathan, who's sitting in London dealing with somebody in a field office who's dealing with somebody in a local community, that kind of organization can work at all these different levels. And I think one of the most important thing we as international peace builders can do is to, first of all, deal with peace building in our jurisdiction, at our level. Look at, we may not have a lot of leverage or influence about what's happening in a local community where we are maybe trying to help, but certainly we should have much more influence and leverage in our own communities where we are located, in terms of reducing harm that our communities could be causing in these local communities that we're working with. One thing I want to maybe preface also my discussion on adaptive mediation about is that when we talk about mediation, I think we can distinguish between many different types of mediation. Ukraine is very much, for instance, at the front of our minds at the moment. And if we think about mediation in a conflict situation like Ukraine, it is about trying to bring an end to the conflict, trying to bring an end to the suffering, using a very broad range of tools. And it's about dealing with some parties, typically in that kind of conflict situation, that still believe they can achieve more through violence than through peace. And that's a very different mediation than a mediation where you're engaging with parties that have reached a point of ripeness where they recognize what Zartman calls a mutual hurting stalemate, or where they recognize that they can't achieve their objectives through violence. They have to switch to seeking a mediated solution. So a lot of what I want to say now about adaptive mediation is really about that second type of mediation setting, because there our goal is to find a self-sustainable peace, not to bring an end to the conflict using any means of leverage that we can. And it speaks a little bit perhaps to the difference between negative peace and positive peace that we also mentioned at various times during our discussion today. And maybe the one thing I would like to say there is that I think it's very useful concepts, but we sometimes think of them too much as a kind of a chronological dimension. I think Jean-Paul also mentioned this morning that these things are happening at the same time. And I think especially when you think about sustaining a negative peace, that is impossible to do without many elements of positive peace being present. So I think these two are more closely interlinked than we often think of. Of course, it's interesting from a kind of analytical perspective to try to make that distinction. But the core puzzle I want to share with you and discuss with you when I talk about adaptive mediation is that over the last few decades, our attempt to professionalize mediation, I think, have had a number of side effects or negative unintended consequences. One of them is that our focus has shifted from an occupation with the conflict and the people involved, the parties to the conflict, to the mediator, to mediation, to peace agreements. We have created a lot of expectations of what we think mediators should achieve, what a peace agreement should contain, the ethics that mediators should bring to the mediation table. And I think the result is that many of the peace agreements that have been adopted, or many of the actions that we take when it comes to how we engage with peace processes, if I make it a bit more broader, reflects more what our expectations are of peace than what they say about the local context or the interests of the parties to the conflict. I think in many cases, mediators and their teams have had so much influence over the process and the content of the agreements reached that the parties to the conflict and the people affected by the conflict don't recognize themselves and their experiences and concerns in the content of the agreement or the content of the process. And of course, as a result, many of the peace agreements adopted or agreed to in these kind of contexts collapse soon after they've been adopted. And that is why I've had this interest to really try to understand and think about how can we make these peace agreements, or then more broader, these peace processes, more sustainable, more self-sustainable. Self-sustainable meaning that they are sustained, implemented, maintained, further developed by the people involved in the conflict, not as a result of external or international influence or support or encouragement. And this brings me to this concept of adaptive mediation, which is a specific approach to mediation that is based on a recognition that the social systems that we are trying to influence through mediation or broader peace processes are complex. In other words, they are emergent, they are dynamic, they are nonlinear, and therefore they are inherently uncertain and unpredictable. Ufra mentioned this morning going to the moon, so I want to use this distinction between something that is complicated and something that is complex by referring to traveling to space. I think we all think that we have this kind of common reference that we make, that if we want to say that what we're doing is not very difficult, we're saying it's not rocket science. Right? Rocket science is very complicated. You need a lot of different types of knowledge to design spaceships, to design how they should be launched and the velocities, etc., etc. But once you've been able to perfect that, you can do that over and over again. In fact, I think the rocket that has been used most up to now to send people into space is the Soyuz rockets, that's essentially been unchanged in design since the 1960s. That's complicated. It's difficult, but it's complicated. Complex, like social systems, mean that we, for instance, like we heard today, we have something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the National Peace Accords that's worked relatively well in a place like South Africa, but we cannot replicate it anywhere else necessarily. We cannot even replicate it in South Africa today because of the different context that it's in, right? So this unpredictability, uncertainty, and irreproducibility are inherent characteristics of complex systems. And that's why peace is so much more difficult to deal with. So next time people belittle our work and say it's not rocket science, you can go back and tell them our work is much more complex than rocket science. So this recognition of complexity, I think, has a number of implications for how we approach our work in peace processes then, but also then especially how we deal with mediation. And I'll focus in on 3 implications. Firstly, this uncertainty and unpredictability mean that we cannot use a deductive theory of change when we try to influence social systems or social change processes. What I mean with that is, because we cannot predict what's going to happen, we cannot design a theory of change with linear step-by-step chronological interventions, which with any certainty is going to produce the result that we intended to have. And this is how, I'll use Graham's 90%, this is how 90% of our peace processes are designed, right? Because when we apply for money, we are forced to come up with a theory of change that shows the funder that we have a high degree and convince the funder that if we take the following steps, we're going to have the following results. I would say that to cope with complexity, we need to use an inductive approach, which basically means that we don't know what's going to work, so we need to try a variety of things. When we try a variety of things, you could call it experimentation if you like, or exploration of different interventions. We need to track those very closely and see which effects they have, which means we need a very relatively short iterative cycle of reflection. I've been part of a team that designed a performance assessment system for UN peacekeeping operations, and they use a 4-month cycle to do this kind of reflective process, right? So you need to judge which of those interventions or steps or actions that you are taking is having the kind of desired effect that you want to have, and which ones are not. And you have to stop doing those that are not working and maybe expand and work more, bring in more diversity in those that seem to have the desired effect. And one thing that's important to remember in this context is that something that may be working today and tomorrow is most likely not going to work next week or next month, because the systems we are engaging with is proactive, conscious human beings that are constantly reacting to how we are engaging with the social system. And if what we are doing is having a certain effect that for which there will be winners and losers, because we are trying to bring about certain change in that society, people will react and find ways to circumvent or go around or find different ways to do what they would like to do. And therefore, even those things that we've come up with in our interventions that seem to work, we need to keep monitoring, because we will need to keep diversifying and keep evolving those as well as we go along. And that's also why it's important, when we talk about peace agreements, to think and understand that a self-sustainable peace agreement is also an evolving peace agreement, or something at least that can manage during its implementation process with a changing and continuous evolving situation. So that's where the adaptiveness and adaptive mediation and adaptive peace comes from. This need to continuously attempt to explore different interventions, monitor them very closely, reflect on how they're doing, introducing new adaptations, understanding that this is a continuous iterative cycle that will never stop. We're not going to arrive at some point with the solution. We need to continuously co-evolve with the changing situation as we go along. So the second implication I want to talk about of complexity and unpredictability for mediation processes has to do with the ownership of the peace agreement. When we were thinking that as experts, we had this knowledge about peace and peace building that we could bring to communities affected by conflict, meant that we had some kind of a privileged experience and knowledge that we could teach or lead communities in process. But if we recognize the social complexity of what we're working with, and we recognize that there isn't a way of predetermining exactly what process will work or what the outcome will be, I think this shows us that the value and the role of the communities we're working with in terms of the knowledge that they have is at least equal to the role that international contributors to peace may or may not have. Right? So to think much more in terms of breaking down this hierarchy or inequality between international peace builders or external peace builders, people who have peace building as a profession, and the local communities we are engaging with. But there's another, I would say, even more important reason to think about the local ownership and the involvement of local communities. And that is that because the process of the content of what we're dealing with when we come and engaging with peace processes or mediation processes have to be context specific, have to relate to the culture and history and realities and interests of the people involved in the conflict. It has to emerge from the process, from themselves. It can be an engagement, and there, of course, a role that mediators and external actors play. Jonathan, I think, spoke very eloquently about the various different contributions that external peace builders or mediators can bring to a process, and the limitations that communities or people affected by conflict may have in terms of their ability to perhaps overcome some of their challenges and so forth. But taking all of that into account, we are not going to arrive at a self-sustainable peace process if the content of that peace process or peace agreement has not been generated by the people engaged in the process. If the content comes from the mediators, then we will see the kind of relapse in peace agreements that we've seen before. So that is a critical element if we want to achieve self-sustainable peace agreements or peace processes. Lastly, the role of the mediator has to, because of this importance of the parties affected by the conflict, the parties to the mediation, because of their importance in the process, the last thing I want to emphasize is then the role of the mediator. What is the appropriate role of the mediator or the peace builder? I would say that it's important that that role should be limited to process facilitation. And it's difficult to put a hard line on it. Of course, that needs interpretation in different situations. But what I would try to say is that mediators, peace builders should stop short of providing content. Content needs to come, the process can come from the mediators, but content needs to come from the local context, from the engagement, from a self-emerging process of the engagement of the local actors or the parties to a mediation. So adaptive mediation is thus a specific approach to mediation designed to cope with the complexity and to generate peace processes and peace agreements that are locally grounded and self-sustainable. That to me is the essence of what I'm trying to convey when I talk about adaptive mediation or adaptive peace processes. How am I doing on time? Okay, I'll just wrap up in there. So one thing is, I know when I talk about it in the way that I spoke to you about it now, it could sound quite theoretical, but I want to bring it down to a practical example. I think one example we heard today that really inspired me in this process as well is the National Peace Accord and the kind of infrastructures for peace that came out of this African experience that Liz told us about earlier today. That was, of course, not designed as an adaptive process, but I think in reality, it really shows the content of the type of process that I'm describing. Because here you had at the local community, on a continuous basis, key actors from the local community coming together, whether it's religious leaders, mayors of town, community leaders, the head of the police, the army if they were around, and all kinds of other community leaders that came together on a continuous basis to either respond to a particular challenge that has emerged from the community, or that as discussing the fault lines that they may see and try to prevent future disputes from arising in their communities. And this is something that is happening iteratively all the time, and that is something happening all the country, and then generating information up to the regional and national levels. And so for me, that's a very practical example of a process that is very iterative, that is learning, that is trying different ways of managing this crisis that they are experiencing, and learning from that and bringing them forward to the next iteration, the lessons learned from the previous experience. So that's maybe one of the examples you can keep in your mind when you think about how this kind of adaptive peace, adaptive mediation process can be imagined in our everyday world. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me if I speak into here? Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much, Cedric. My conclusion then from today, bringing together your reflections with those of John Paul Lederach, is that we need long funding cycles and short cycles of analysis to adapt to ongoing scenarios. So thinking in long and short. Okay, we have time for about 10 minutes of Q&A, and then I think we might even more or less catch up with ourselves. So have I got some people with roving mics around to help with this moment? Abby's on the task. Thank you. So I can see one question over here, and one down here, and one up there. We'll start with those three.
Thank you. So I have a slightly provocative question that's prompted by Phil's presentation on Rwanda. And my question is reconciliation only really possible under conditions of authoritarianism? And let me briefly explain how I got there. So I actually started my own peacebuilding experience in 1994 in Rwanda, and spent the next 10 years or so working in the Central Africa region, obviously in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. And over the sort of subsequent 30 years or so of working in peacebuilding, you know, it's several times I've had the reflection that, you know, the goal of creating a sense of national identity that transcends ethnic identities and the divisions and polarization that come with that. That is so fundamental to our work of building peace. And it was touched upon by some of the other speakers earlier today, by, I think, Raja when he was talking about Afghanistan, and by Brandon talking about Northern Ireland. You know, if only we can build this sense of a national identity. And Phil, you described how in Rwanda, the fact that there has been an economic uplift and a shared economic uplift between, you know, shared equally both by Hutu and by Tutsi. If I understood you correctly, it's that has contributed to reconciliation and contributed to a sense of national identity that, as I say, transcends the ethnic divisions. So I guess my question is, has the success of these reconciliation efforts in Rwanda and the development of a national identity, has that come about despite or because of a Rwandan state that, as you acknowledged, you know, is illiberal, is authoritarian, and indeed some would consider it as the very embodiment of negative peace and sort of latent conflict, you know, where political dissent and opposition are repressed. There's no effective political opposition, no independent media. Yeah, so do the benefits that you've described and, you know, really encouragingly of the sort of Colleen level reconciliation, how do we weigh those benefits against a state that's very illiberal and very authoritarian? Thank you.
Thanks very much. There's a question down here. Yeah, down here.
Well, I'm curious about many issues, but let me start by explaining that one of my main questions has to do with the practical approach we should bear in mind at the local level for implementing holistic strategies as positive peace, for example. I did my dissertation based on the positive peace approach that the Institute for Economics and Peace provides with 8 pillars. And while I was doing that exercise of constructing the analytical framework, I compared all the time with practical experiences in my country, in Colombia, with the government. And one of the main gaps I have found is that sometimes, because today we have been talking about the importance of having a balance between top-down strategies and bottom-up strategies for involving community and all the stakeholders and all of that. And actually in my city, I have seen how they have been involving all the time stakeholders for constructing solutions, and providing this holistic approach for positive peace and so on. But one of the main problems was to deal with the political will, in terms that at the end of the story, the government doesn't want to invest in what people want them to invest. So sometimes we can have good intentions. They can have some international cooperation, for example, with United Nations for approaching in a very good and strategical way the community for constructing solutions, but at the end of they are not taking those opinions into account because the government has other priorities. And that's one of the main challenges we have nowadays, to deal with a balance between priorities from the government and priorities from the community. So I would like to ask how to deal with it, or what kind of strategies we can approach for getting a better balance between both.
Thank you very much. And then I think Raja had a question. Sorry, Abby, to make you run all the way to the back. You don't have to run. Oh, don't worry, Abby. Liz has got one coming up the other side.
Thank you so much. Such amazing presentations. And I would say, Phil, thank you so much for introducing irreconciliation, you know, reminding us. So I just briefly, this is perhaps my apprehension or reading that, you know, the three types of conflict, you know, 3 I's you could say, you know, identity-based conflict, interest-based conflict, and ideological conflict. And I feel that somehow that, you know, peace building has been, or peace builders have been far more successful with the first two, identity-based and interest-based, but not so much perhaps with ideological conflict. And I feel that's where we're falling, you know, short, whether it's Somalia or, you know, in the Sahel region, or, you know, with Boko Haram and so on. I just wonder, you know, whether we're in the pursuit of immediate gains of peace, are we, you know, falling short of changing people's mind, or eliminating prejudice, and changing and actually having, you know, really long-term discussions in changing ideology? And if you perhaps know cases where, you know, we have succeeded vis-a-vis such conflict, and would love to know. Thank you. That's true to both of you.
Thank you very much. And another question here, and I think unless there's any other burning hands, I think we might wrap up with those questions.
Thank you to both. The question, I guess, is aimed at Cedric. I was really struck by the sort of the model you were presenting of mediation. I guess I recognize, I think it's correct to say that sort of at the high level diplomacy, mediation can involve an element of content based, as you were suggesting. But at sort of the kind of lower level or grassroots level, it would be like, I guess, a mediator wouldn't necessarily be expected to get involved in the contact. So I started to wonder if there was sort of from community-based mediation models, or even the transformative model, which kind of not only kind of puts the substantive elements, but also the procedural elements into the hands of the parties, by having a very fluid conversation, whether or not by reaching down into the lower level models of mediation, there might be something. It seems to me there are echoes there anyway of what you were saying.
Fantastic. So I think we might go in the reverse order this time. So if first Cedric and then Phil, if you'd like to respond to any of the questions and comments that have been raised, and or to each other's presentations.
Thank you very much. Yes, no, I think community level conflicts, I guess, tend to be, you know, more about real local issues like weapons-free zones or other kind of issues which tend to be much more context specific than, let's say, national large-scale peace agreements, where you also then have the big international mediation teams involved, where the risk of bringing in, you know, kind of international topics and issues and expectations and templates are much higher. So I think that makes sense what you're saying. Of course, we all would agree that parties to the conflict should be the ones to determine the content and should be the ones to be the main actors in mediation processes. So what's to me shocking is the degree to which that's actually doesn't happen in real life mediation processes. The degree to which in most real life mediation processes, at least national mediation processes with international mediators, the degree of influence that they have is quite enormous in terms of the content that's produced. Roger, I'm not sure if I understood your question or in the way that you intended it, but I would say when it comes to ideological differences, it is as the same with, I guess, interest and value differences to a large degree. It's of course normal that societies should have ideological differences. The problem is with pursuing violent means to pursue those interests. So it's not as if we're trying to resolve the fact that there is ideological differences or even value or interest differences in a society, but it's about the means of pursuing those interests in a society and what political process you generate in your society to manage those conflicts. Those conflicts exist in all our societies. The challenge to shift the process in such a way that you build the institutions necessary to make sure that happens peacefully and, you know, through an agreed, for instance, legal system and so forth. But let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cedric. Phil, how about you?
Yeah, so let me take the question on reconciliation and authoritarianism. Look, I think that my short answer would be no. I don't think that the RPF's illiberality, its authoritarianism, is essential for the gains the country's made in terms of reconciliation. But I do think that a strong state was important, has been important. I think a well-organized, well-coordinated state that could organize Gacaca, get the welfare system off the ground, engage in a really systematic form of civic education, I think is absolutely crucial in that sense. And I think the importance of a strong state really comes into focus when you compare Rwanda to its neighbors, all of which have gone through similar cyclical conflicts over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, one of the things that characterizes places like Uganda, Burundi, and the DRC is a high degree of state dysfunctionality, which I think has really made peace and reconciliation very difficult. So I think the strong state that Rwanda has been critical in this respect, but, and I'm being a bit schematic here, I think that's gone too far. I think the extent of the illiberality under the RPF risks undermining some of the crucial gains that the government's made in a couple of senses. So one of the long strands in my research is that so many of my respondents, post 94, talk about how much pressure they feel from the government. So that they don't feel fearful. Fear is not the dominant response, at least in my interviews, but there's a sense of pressure. This state keeps an eye on us. This state wants us to behave as good citizens in specific ways. And that's a heavy burden to bear. We don't have a sense of freedom. We don't have a sense of being able to pursue our lives necessarily in the way that we might like. And the RPF does that really systematically, exerts that kind of pressure. The other drawback of this very illiberal regime is, of course, the systematic suppression of certain historical narratives. Now, I don't want to get into a long discussion about Rwandan history here. And I think there's a huge amount of misinformation in the public domain at the moment about Rwandan history. But it is true that there were crimes committed by the RPF against innocent Hutu civilians, particularly after the 1994 genocide. And those have been systematically suppressed. They are fundamentally unrecognized in Rwandan society. I mean, a very senior member of the RPF about 5-6 years ago, must be said, he was about 6 pints down at the time, said to me, the government made a real mistake in not having something like Gacaca for RPF crimes, at least to take the sting out of a lot of the genocide denial that is in circulation at the moment. That there could have been a process at least to acknowledge that the RPF had done those things, that it was a set of crimes fundamentally different from the genocide, different in scale, different in nature, different in consequence. But to have made it essentially impossible to have that kind of discussion is a problem. And I hear it in my interviews. I mean, one of the interesting things about Gacaca on the fringes of the process, at the end of the process, 2011, 2012, far from Kigali, some communities that didn't have very much government surveillance started to talk about RPF crimes in the midst of Gacaca. So even in the midst of this process that had been created by the Rwandan government, that they were talking about crimes that were considered anathema to that state and potentially could have brought very serious consequences on those communities if that came out. But what that showed was how important it was for Hutu communities in certain parts of the country where RPF crimes were committed to have the space to talk about that. And you can't in Rwanda today. That is really impossible. So I guess what I'm saying is a strong state with low corruption and a high degree of coordination has been really important in terms of reconciliation. But that shouldn't justify the extent of the authoritarianism that we see under Kagame. And I think part of the danger there is that it might start to undermine some of the really significant benefits that the country's experienced. I was going to say something about the ideological conflicts question, but I think Cedric's answered that perfectly, Gwen. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. Cedric, do you want to jump in on this other question?
Yes, we had the question about the governments don't want to invest in what people want, and how do we deal with priorities. And I guess one thing I would try to say about that is that we are not going to resolve all tensions in society through peace processes, but those are normal tensions that we have in all our societies, that there's different priorities that different communities and people may have. But what we, I think, try to do is to help to start a process of generating the local social institutions that are there to manage those tensions so that they don't turn violent. And for me, I would scale that up slightly on the reconciliation issue as well. Even if I think some of the examples we had today, Rwanda, South Africa, Northern Ireland, for instance, I don't think, these are not absolutes. But in both of these cases, you do not have authoritarian regimes that are imposing reconciliation to the degree that there is reconciliation. Neither would I say the national identities in those two countries overshadow the other identities that people have. So these are not things of perfection, but it's about changing the level of discontent and irreconcilability in some societies to the point where people don't choose violence to pursue those sense of injustice or so on. And for instance, we heard very worrying news about Colombia, that all these killings that are taking place, people seem to be taking kind of some of these grievances into their own hands. So that's what we're trying to, I think, avoid in terms of the quality of the process that we can try to achieve. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cedric, and thank you both of our speakers for this fantastic panel on thinking about how to factor in the unexpected into processes of peace building. So please join me in giving you both a round of applause. And before you all rush off, thank you all so much for your resilience and patience. And I will hand over to Liz, who's going to make some closing remarks.
Well, I think we've had a most fantastic day, and the enthusiasm has been palpable. So thank you all in the audience, and thank you online for all of your attentive participation. I think it's an illustration of just how far the field of peace building, and the term is relatively new, has come, that we've been able to have such a rich discussion today on so many topics around the field of peace building. So I'd like to thank particularly Phil for rising from your sickbed, if you're still there, and for contributing. That worked pretty well. And can we thank Richie at the back for his technical expertise throughout the day? Thank you. And the St. John's caterers, who I think did us proud with the sandwiches. So again, to all our speakers, thank you very much indeed for coming, in some cases from quite far away. And I suppose it's an illustration of the almost post-COVID world that there are planes scribbling on the sky every day again. And some of our speakers have availed themselves of that. So until next time, no doubt we'll be thinking about another conference for next year. Please do think of being on the Oxpeace mailing list. I hope that I will be able to send out an email to all of you who've registered, inviting you, if you're not already on an Oxpeace mailing list, to join. And as we usually say each year, if you know any millionaires, Oxford University is officially looking for the endowment for posts in peace studies, which is a great thing to know. So we just need the millionaires, please. So many thanks again. Go well on your journeys, and see you again. All the best. And a word from Andre.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Thank you so much for everyone. I would like to also start with thanking Lucia Bihar, who is online and has been up since 9 in the morning making this happened on the side of Rodemos el Diálogo, far away from Oxford, and has helped us, stream this across the world. So hopefully many people can go back to YouTube, to the channel of Rodemos el Diálogo, and watch this conference again. All the links are publicly available there. Liz, thank you so much for partnering with Rodemos el Diálogo. It's been a great pleasure to work with you. Thank you so much for your generosity. I think Abby has been great running around, and all the Ox Peace committee. Thank you so much. Let me say two things just on behalf of Rodemos el Diálogo. We believe in 6 principles, but 2 principles I think have come to the fore today. One is the principle of self-criticism, and is this conference for us 10 years after started building peace in Colombia is a reminder of the humbleness that we need to have in order to recognize that we are imperfect human beings who always try to do our best to create a better world. And I think that's the critical infrastructure, because who built peace? Well, all of us, step by step, little by little. And that is the second principle that we believe in Rodemos el Diálogo, the principle of co-responsibility. We all have a role to play. And if today we have learned something, is that we are part of this broader network of people who believe in this. So thank you so much to Ox Peace for being part of this too. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to Rodemos for making the whole Zooming experience possible. Thank you. Right. And please don't forget, your badges will be gratefully received. Please put them in the box on the registration table and encourage others to do so. Thanks.